Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of resilience, love, and redemption. Today, we bring you Emily's journey, a story of a young woman cast out by her family but determined to rebuild her life against all odds. From the harsh streets of Willow Springs to finding an unexpected ally, Emily's path is one of pain, hope, and ultimately, forgiveness. Her story will touch your heart and remind you of the strength that lies within us all. Subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's inspiring journey. And don't miss the lessons woven into Emily's tale. Emily stood at the edge of the small southern town of Willow Springs, a place where every picket fence seemed to hide secrets behind closed doors. To an outsider, it was idyllic, tree-lined streets, neatly trimmed lawns, and neighbors who always greeted each other with a smile. But to Emily, it was a town of judgment, where appearances meant everything and individuality was often smothered under the weight of conformity. She had grown up in one of those houses, her family's seemingly perfect facade concealing a world of control and expectation. Her father, Robert, was a man of routine, a mechanic by trade. His hands were always coated in grease, his demeanor gruff, his expectations clear, respect his rules, and everything would be fine. Her mother, Linda, was the opposite. Always prim and proper, constantly concerned with the opinions of others. Linda spent her days hosting book clubs, organizing church events, and ensuring that their family was seen as the epitome of decency in Willow Springs. Emily's younger sister, Sophie, just 10 years old, still carried an innocence Emily envied. Sophie idolized their mother, believing every word she said and never daring to question the rules that governed their lives. Emily, at 16, had long outgrown the illusions her family upheld. Quiet by nature, she often retreated into her sketchbook, drawing scenes of a life she could only dream of, places filled with light, warmth, and freedom. Most afternoons, she would escape to the old oak tree at the edge of town, the only place she felt truly herself. It was there, one golden evening, that she met James. James was everything Willow Springs wasn't. He was from a neighboring town, full of dreams about escaping the constraints of small-town life and exploring the world. For the first time, Emily felt seen. James didn't care about her family's rules or the town's expectations, he cared about her. They would sit under the oak tree for hours, talking about places they'd never been and futures they could barely imagine. For a few fleeting months, Emily felt alive. But dreams often end abruptly. When Emily discovered she was pregnant, the reality of her situation came crashing down. She told James one evening under the same oak tree, hoping he would share her fear and resolve. Instead, his face paled, and he mumbled something about needing time. That was the last time she saw him. He vanished, leaving her to face the fallout alone. Emily held on to the secret for as long as she could. Terrified of what her parents would say, she carried the weight of it in silence until Sophie, in her usual curious and innocent way, barged into her room without knocking one evening. Emily had just taken out the crumpled remains of the positive pregnancy test, staring at it with a mix of dread and disbelief. Sophie's wide eyes immediately locked onto it. "What's that?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. Emily scrambled to hide the test. But the damage was done. Sophie's gasp was audible, and her expression shifted from confusion to fear. "Don't tell anyone," Emily pleaded. But Sophie ran from the room, tears streaming down her face. The confrontation came swiftly. That evening, Linda stormed into the living room, holding the pregnancy test like a weapon. Her fury was palpable, her voice a whip of anger and condemnation. "How dare you bring this shame into my house?" she screamed. "Do you have any idea what you've done? What people will say?" Emily tried to explain, but her mother's words drowned her out. Her father, Robert, sat silently at first, his expression unreadable. But when he finally spoke, his words were colder than any of Linda's anger. "You're no daughter of mine," he said, his tone resolute. Emily felt her heart shatter. The argument escalated into a full-blown fight between her parents. Linda blamed Robert for being too distant. Robert accused Linda of failing to raise their daughters properly. All the while, Emily stood frozen, tears streaming down her face, feeling more like a bystander in her own life than a participant. Then came the moment that changed everything. Linda grabbed Emily by the arm, dragging her to the front door. "If you won't follow the rules of this house, you won't live in it," she spat, shoving Emily out into the pouring rain. The door slammed shut behind her, leaving her standing on the porch, drenched and shivering. She could hear Sophie sobbing inside, her cries muffled but unmistakable. Emily turned back, pounding on the door, pleading to be let in. But there was no answer. Behind her, the neighbors peeked out from their windows, their faces a mix of curiosity and judgment. Whispers carried through the rain, cutting through Emily like knives. With nowhere else to go, she began to walk. The rain soaked through her clothes, plastering her hair to her face. She wandered aimlessly, past the familiar landmarks of her childhood, the school playground, the church, the diner where she and James used to meet. Each step was heavier than the last, her breath shaky as she fought back sobs. Every memory of her parents' home, her sister's laughter, and James's promises felt like a cruel mockery now. By the time the rain stopped, Emily found herself on the outskirts of Willow Springs. The streetlights cast long shadows on the empty road, and the first rays of sunlight began to creep over the horizon. She sat on a bench in the deserted park, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, trying to hold together the pieces of her shattered world. As exhaustion overtook her, she thought of the tiny life growing inside her. It was the only thing keeping her from succumbing entirely to despair. In the darkest moment of her young life, Emily resolved one thing: she might have been abandoned by those she loved, but she would not abandon herself or the life she carried. It was this fragile spark of determination that kept her going, even as the world around her seemed intent on breaking her. The sun rose slowly over the quiet town of Willow Springs, its golden light casting long shadows across the empty streets. Emily sat on the park bench, cold and trembling. The rain had stopped, but her soaked clothes clung to her like the weight of her despair. She hadn't slept much. Every noise from the darkened streets startled her awake, leaving her clutching her arms for warmth and protection. Yet, amidst the exhaustion and fear, one thought burned in her mind: she couldn't give up, not for herself and not for the tiny life growing inside her. By mid-morning, hunger gnawed at her stomach, a reminder of how unprepared she was for the life she now faced. She needed shelter, food, and, most importantly, a plan. Her eyes fell on the convenience store down the street, its bright sign a beacon in the otherwise grey morning. Gathering her courage, Emily walked inside, the hum of refrigerators and the smell of brewed coffee filling the small space. She wandered the aisles, her fingers brushing against cans of soup, packages of bread, and bottles of water. She didn't have any money, but her hunger outweighed her shame. Picking up a sandwich and a bottle of water, Emily approached the counter, her trembling hands clutching the items like lifelines. The clerk, a middle-aged man with a gruff demeanor, looked her over with a frown. His gaze lingered on her rain-soaked hair and mud-streaked shoes. "You got money for that?" he asked, his tone sharp and dismissive. Emily froze, fumbling in her pockets though she knew they were empty. I don't," she stammered, her cheeks flushing with humiliation. She placed the items back on the counter, muttering an apology before turning to leave. As she walked away, she heard the clerk mutter under his breath, "Another charity case. Just what this town needs." His words stung, but Emily didn't stop. She pushed open the door and stepped back into the chilly morning air, tears blurring her vision. She leaned against the wall outside the store, sliding down until she was sitting on the curb. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to hold back the sobs that threatened to overwhelm her. She couldn't survive like this. Not on her own. The realization hit her with a force she hadn't expected. And for the first time since being thrown out, Emily allowed herself to cry openly. The world felt impossibly large and unkind. And she was so very small in it. As the hours passed, Emily wandered aimlessly through Willow Springs. Every glance from a passerby, every whisper behind her back, felt like another nail in the coffin of her old life. By evening, her feet ached, her stomach growled, and her spirit felt close to breaking. She had no idea where she was going until she stumbled upon a small, weathered house at the end of a dirt road. The porch light flickered softly, casting a warm glow on the rickety steps. Emily hesitated, her hand hovering over the gate. She had no reason to believe the people inside would treat her any differently from those she'd encountered earlier. But the faint light seemed to call to her, a fragile beacon in the darkness. Before she could make a decision, the front door opened, and an elderly woman stepped outside. Her silver hair was tied back in a loose bun, and her sharp eyes scanned the horizon. She spotted Emily immediately, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them moved. "You just going to stand there? Or are you coming in?" the woman said, her voice firm but not unkind. Emily felt her legs carry her forward before her mind could catch up. Inside, the house was small but cozy, filled with the smell of something cooking on the stove. The woman motioned for Emily to sit at the kitchen table. Without a word, she ladled soup into a bowl and placed it in front of her. Emily hesitated, unsure if this kindness came with a price. The woman's sharp voice cut through her thoughts. "Eat," she said, leaving no room for argument. Emily picked up the spoon and took a tentative sip. The warmth of the soup spread through her, easing the chill that had settled deep in her bones. For the first time since being cast out, she felt a sliver of comfort. "My name's Martha," the woman said, sitting across from her. "You look like you've been through hell." Emily nodded, her throat tightening as she tried to respond. The words wouldn't come, but Martha didn't press her. Instead, the older woman began to talk, her voice steady and soothing. She spoke of her life, of the hardships she had faced, and the family she had lost. Her stories were woven with pain and resilience, a testament to a life lived against the odds. For the first time since her world had fallen apart, Emily felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, she had found a place to start over. The days that followed were unlike anything Emily could have imagined. Martha's small, weathered house became her refuge, a sanctuary from the harsh world she had faced since being cast out. The older woman didn't ask too many questions, nor did she judge. She simply provided a roof over Emily's head, a warm meal on the table, and the kind of quiet companionship that made the loneliness bearable. Martha was sharp-tongued but kind-hearted, her words often blunt but never cruel. "You're carrying more than just that baby," she said one morning as they sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea between them. "You're carrying guilt, fear, and shame too. It's heavy, isn't it?" Emily didn't reply, but the tears that welled up in her eyes spoke volumes. Martha reached across the table, her gnarled hand resting gently on Emily's. "You're young, but you're strong. You'll get through this. And when you do, you'll be stronger for it." Martha's support wasn't just emotional. She taught Emily practical skills: how to sew, how to stretch every dollar, how to cook meals that could last for days. These lessons were interwoven with stories from Martha's past, tales of hardship and resilience that made Emily feel less alone. Over time, Emily began to trust her, opening up in small, hesitant ways. She told Martha about her parents, her sister, and the boy who had left her to face the consequences alone. "James wasn't worth your tears," Martha said one evening as they washed dishes together. "A real man doesn't run when things get hard. And as for your parents, well, some people value their pride more than their own blood. That doesn't mean you're unworthy of love." Emily. Those words stayed with Emily. echoing in her mind late at night as she lay on the small cot in the corner of Martha's spare room. She hadn't thought of herself as worthy of anything in a long time. But slowly, with Martha's help, she began to see glimmers of hope. Months passed, and as Emily's belly grew, so did her determination. She found small ways to contribute around the house, helping Martha with chores and learning to manage their modest garden. Though the whispers and judgment from the townsfolk hadn't disappeared, Emily found herself caring less. She had a purpose now, and that purpose was the tiny life growing inside her. One crisp morning, as Emily walked through the small market with Martha, the stares were as sharp as ever. Whispers followed them, cutting through the air like knives. "That's the girl," someone muttered. "Why does Martha bother with her?" A man stopped Martha on the street, his tone dripping with condescension. "Why do you waste your time on her? She's nothing but trouble." Martha's response was simple and firm. "Because someone has to." Her words were a shield, protecting Emily from the harshness of the world around them. For the first time in a long time, Emily felt like she had an ally, someone who saw her not for her mistakes but for her potential. When the time finally came for Emily to give birth, it was a cold and clear night. Martha moved with the calm precision of someone who had seen it all before, guiding Emily through the pain with steady hands and soothing words. The hours stretched on, each one more grueling than the last. But Emily held on. She thought of everything she had endured to get to this moment, the life she was about to bring into the world. When her daughter's first cries filled the room, Emily's exhaustion melted into a flood of emotion. She held the tiny baby close, marveling at the perfect, fragile being in her arms. "Grace," she whispered, the name coming to her as naturally as breath. "Her name is Grace." Martha stood beside her, a rare smile softening her features. "She's beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. In that moment, Emily felt something she hadn't in years: hope. She had survived. She had brought new life into the world. And as she looked down at her daughter's tiny face, she realized that this was only the beginning. Grace was her reason to keep going, her anchor in the storm. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, Emily believed that she could face it. With Martha's guidance and her own growing strength, she was determined to build a life for herself and her daughter, a life filled with love, resilience, and hope. In the years that followed, Emily transformed her life from one of despair to one of strength and hope. With Martha's unwavering support and her own resilience, she built a warm and welcoming cafe in the heart of Willow Springs, where the aroma of coffee and baked goods greeted every customer. Her daughter, Grace, grew into a bright, joyful teenager, embodying the love and determination that had carried Emily through her darkest moments. Emily's journey was one of healing and forgiveness. When her estranged mother reappeared, seeking reconciliation, Emily chose not to be defined by anger. Instead, she took small, brave steps toward understanding, proving that forgiveness is as much for the forgiver as it is for the forgiven. Emily's story reminds us that even in the face of hardship, hope can bloom. Subscribe to Life Stories for more inspiring tales like this. And don't miss our next video.